Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Dr. Samuels, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to be asking the juror questions you submitted in the order you submitted them. If you have any questions about this procedure, please refer back to your preliminary jury instructions. Are you only allowed to testify about a client's conversations with their consent?
Yes. And just to clarify for the jury, a consent form is signed by the client and they are instructed and informed that they do not have the same degree of confidentiality that they would have if they were being treated as a patient, and that anything that is said in the interview could be used in a report which will be handed into the court.
In the fight or flight scenario, does the body choose either to fight or flee?
That depends largely on the circumstances. The impulse is, there's a tendency for the impulses to flee. But in the event that you can flee, or if there are opportunities to protect yourself in a more direct fashion, then that tendency may evolve. But the tendency is to flee for most circumstances.
Can both occur at the same time?
Yes, we see that type of behavior. We saw it in this particular case as well, where there was an attempt to flee and at the same time...
He's answering the question.
Overruled. You may continue.
Thank you. Where a person then flees to a point where they can no longer flee, and therefore another set of self-survival behaviors kicks in. And so, yes, they can occur not necessarily simultaneously, but in a successive fashion.
Can memories blocked in a fight or flight event return over time, or are they forever lost?
If the hippocampus is truly flooded and shut down by the presence of these various chemicals that are rushed into the brain through the amygdala, unlikely those memories can ever be restored because they were never there to begin with. Sometimes memories can be restored if there's something there that you might be able to work on. But here, they were not recorded. It's as if you had a digital recording, let's say, and there was something wrong with the memory. It wouldn't be there.
How can we be certain that your assessment of Ms. Arias is not based on the lies that she has admittedly made over the years?
The diagnosis of PTSD is a function of a evaluation based upon, in my case, 35 years of experience in working with individuals with PTSD. You look at the fact pattern, you look at the circumstances that occurred at the time of the trauma, you look to see from the diagnostic list which of these characteristics are presented by the client, and it is on that that you make your diagnosis. And I can say that within all reasonable psychological probability, she does meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Did you use hypnosis on Ms. Arias to attempt to recover her memory?
No, I did not.
To your knowledge, did anyone else use hypnosis on Ms. Arias to attempt to recover her memory?
Not to my knowledge.
During the fight or flight reaction, do you believe it is possible that these memories do in fact exist?
Well, I'm basing my assumption on what I know about the physiology of memory, and it is less likely that memories are formed during that state of excitement and arousal. So I would have to say there's a high probability that the memories do not exist. They never existed.
If someone with that experience could draw from photos, journals, videos, and other methods, could they not extract some old, lost, or forgotten memories?
What happens sometimes is that people begin to read about what happened to them, and they hear stories from people who were there at the time of the incident, whatever that is. They may see photographs of what happened. They may begin to incorporate that information and form pseudo-memories that aren't real memories. They may begin to learn about the incident, but not from firsthand memories. But the strange thing about human memory is that we can sometimes be, sometimes are called implanted memories. And if you say things enough to an individual, especially children, you can actually get them to believe something that you've implanted, as opposed to having it been a true memory experience for them. So it's possible, but unlikely, especially for adults.
Are there other psychologists or doctors in your field who have differing opinions on the items you testified about, or is there 100% consensus in your field?
In psychology, there's never 100% consensus except in the rarest of circumstances. We usually couch our diagnoses and our assumptions and our theories and our hypotheses in terms such as in all reasonable psychological probability. Unlike some areas of medicine where if there was an appendicitis attack, you can actually go in and see that damaged appendix, remove it, and you now know the person does not have an appendix any longer. Psychology is not that precise. So we need to couch things in terms of probabilities as opposed to absolutes.
I believe you said acute stress disorder can be diagnosed within 2 months of the stress event, and you also said you diagnosed Ms. Arias with this, yet you didn't have your first discussion with her until 2009, more than 6 months after the event. Please clarify.
I will. I was able to diagnose Ms. Arias with post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as I indicated earlier, within all reasonable psychological probability, she was suffering from at the time that I evaluated her. Now, it's important to note that the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is not a get-out-of-jail-free diagnosis. It's simply a statement that describes her emotional state at the time that the evaluation occurred. But the fact is that post-traumatic stress disorder is frequently connected to someone having undergone an acute stress reaction. You go up to Flagstaff, Arizona, and you see the giant meteor crater. Well, it was not always known that that was a meteor crater. For hundreds of years, I'm sure the people that lived there, having no scientific background and experience, believed it to be a depression in the earth. As people began to investigate that, it became more apparent, as knowledge began to accrue, that a meteorite actually hit the surface of the earth, forming that crater. The crash of the meteorite in Arizona, maybe 100, 150,000 years ago, I believe, was the equivalent of the acute stress disorder. The crater that's in the ground is the equivalent of the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, it's not an excuse, and it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's something that describes what had happened before and gives us the impetus to go back and explore and to look and see what happened during the time of the trauma. And from that, we can infer that the trauma was of significant nature, of significant enough nature, that it could very likely have led to amnesia, dissociative amnesia, from that experience.
On what dates did Ms. Arias take the tests?
The tests were given at the end of December of 2009 and at the beginning of January 2010.
Can you be sure Jodi is not lying to you about the events on June 4, 2008?
Not with 100% certainty. I can't say that. However, when you look at the repeated stories, several different times asked the same question, the story was not 100% the same, but the basic aspects of the story were sufficient, and it seemed to, at least with certain elements, be consistent with the description of the crime scene. So I would say there's a very strong probability that once she finally told the right story, the second story, that she was being truthful at that time.
Would the shutdown of the hippocampus be affected by the level of control an individual has over the traumatic event? For example, a soldier intentionally bursts bursts into a room to kill an individual versus an individual jumps out at a soldier on routine patrol?
Yes, in fact, if someone is trained specifically for combat, the likelihood of them developing a stress reaction at the time of a battle is significantly reduced, but not totally. And all you have to do is to look at the press releases, follow the television and radio reports, and see the number of cases of post-traumatic stress disorder that occur with our trained military people. Earlier in the trial, I referred to a Time magazine article that was referring to a trained police veteran who was a trainer, actually, who himself was involved in a shooting incident or where he was threatened with a gun. And he had many of the characteristics of an acute stress disorder. So even with training, it doesn't guarantee that you won't react with acute stress, but it does reduce your probability.
Regarding the events of June 4, 2008, do you feel Jodi had suppressed memories, or are they missing entirely?
It depends. Now, I can't measure that because we don't have the tools. We don't have a psychological MRI, for example, to check to see what memories truly exist. But based upon what is known about acute stress disorder and what is known about the neurology of memory formation, I would say it's highly unlikely that she has true memories of what occurred during that period of time when she was in acute distress.
If you feel she had suppressed memories, did you try hypnosis? If not, why?
In the case of dissociative amnesia, the memories are not there to bring back. Now, as I indicated, I have been asked by police departments at various times to try to use hypnosis. I've used it a few times. It's generally not all that helpful. It's because in cases of dissociative amnesia, the memories aren't there. Yet, it has been successful a few times, especially for officers to try to remember more clearly the description of the particular perpetrator that was involved in the interaction that they were having. I would say the probability of success is relatively small, and I generally don't use it for those purposes anymore because it was simply not cost effective.
As a professional, what steps do you take to assure yourself that someone has truly lost their memory or suppressed their memory, as opposed to simply lying about an event?
You have to look at the surrounding information. I have no way of being 100% sure that what we're dealing with here is dissociative amnesia, and yet all the evidence strongly suggests that within all reasonable probability, this is what happened. The reason we say this is because over the years, a great deal of research has been conducted on people who have been in similar situations, and there are consistent reports of dissociative amnesia occurring. It's a true phenomenon. It's not something made up. In fact, 30% of people convicted of homicide report amnesia, and it depends upon the nature of the killing. So I'm pretty confident that we can be fairly certain that she does suffer from amnesia for that period of time of the acute stress.
Do you feel it is possible for an individual to fool professionals into believing they have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder?
Again, if you take someone, they tell you the story one time, you really have nothing to compare that with. And that's why a thorough investigation, a thorough evaluation is the proper way to conduct such an evaluation. You just don't stop there. You start looking at the surrounding information. You try to get collateral input. In this particular case, we had crime scene descriptions. We had crime scene photographs. I re-interviewed her several times to get the story in several different ways. And it is my feeling that once the story changed, she was essentially telling what actually happened. We were also able to confirm the presence of trauma-related symptoms through the testing. The testing is sensitive to the presence of trauma. Now again, is this a 100% accurate situation? Like taking someone's temperature and it's 102.7 and we pretty much know that that's the temperature? No, it isn't. These are probabilistic techniques, and much of it is based upon our experience and a review of the other people's work in the field. And I'm pretty confident that she does suffer from amnesia and post-traumatic stress disorder.
To your knowledge, was Jodi tested more than once on any given test?
Not to my knowledge.
When you meet with someone, are you able to definitely tell when someone is lying or telling the truth, or is it based on your perceptions?
Well, unless you have corroborating information, or an individual is able to show through, well, that's corroborating information, actually. No, you can't. You have to go back and explore as much information as you can. If I had a way of telling whether someone was lying, my job would be a lot easier.
You stated she never said a negative thing in her journal, yet she made statements like she wishes suicide was a way out, but there is no escape, and said of Travis that he makes her sick and happy, sad, and miserable. Are those considered positive statements, referring to Exhibit 510?
Those are relatively mild statements in terms of the degree of what was written, the 1,500 to 2,000 pages, and not as many pages, obviously, from the period of time that she knew Mr. Alexander. But there was nothing in there like, I want to kill him, or I wish he were dead, or I wish I could, rip his eyes out. Nothing like that at all. Those were probably the strongest negative statements in her writings. And in comparison to all the verbiage that was flowery and positive, it's extremely mild and extremely minimal. So while those could be examples, if you compare it to all the other writings in her journals, there's really very little evidence that she is a violent person.
Are there other disorders in the DSM-IV book that would list the same or similar symptoms or experiences?
Well, there's a similarity between post-traumatic stress disorder and an acute stress disorder. And the difference being that the acute stress disorder is primarily diagnosed within a month or so of the actual incident. So you need to be able to interview the individual very shortly after the incident. Well, obviously that was not possible. But post-traumatic stress disorder is basically the shadow of the possibility of an acute stress disorder having occurred earlier. And that's the example I gave earlier about the meteor crater. That's what the shadow of a catastrophic event that occurred a long time ago. But through investigation, we can ultimately determine what happened.
Is there any science to explain why some people can recall events and others cannot when involved in a stressful moment?
We know that there are individual differences. Not everybody in the same situation will experience and react to the stress in the same way. Some people may just have a high tolerance for responding to that type of stress, and others don't. Sometimes it's hard to predict what type of person is more prone to that than others. So while it's hard to say, we know that it happens enough of the time to make it fairly highly probable that she did suffer the experience of an acute, and was diagnosable at the time with acute stress disorder by implication, but not by having been there, because that was impossible.
How do you ask your questions when interviewing an individual? Do you ask leading questions such as, do you experience memory loss, or do you have nightmares?
There are times when you have to ask a directed question such as that, but most of the time I just allow the individual to speak. If after several meetings they are not getting to that particular target, then I might have to ask a leading question. But part of our training is to ask questions in such a way that they minimally influence the answer.
You previously said 3 to 8 out of 100,000 people experience transient global amnesia. Now you say 3 to 8%, which is significantly higher. Which is correct?
It's 3 to 8 per 100,000 per year, not percent. cases per year.
You said transient global amnesia can be caused by sexual intercourse, immersion in hot or cold water, and a number of other things. Is the list you presented all-inclusive, or could it also be caused by something such as the trauma associated with getting a bad haircut, for example?
I would say that's unlikely, because those traumas that cause this are typically physiologically connected situations. Sudden change of body temperature, the sudden convulsions associated with intercourse. The list is extensive and inclusive as far as the 119 articles that were reviewed in order to get that data. But there were probably some other types of situations that could bring about a transient global amnesia. But again, it's only those conclusions are only limited to the 119 articles that were reviewed for that particular study.
Is Ms. Arias taking medication to treat this terrible PTSD disorder?
She has been taking, at various times, she was on a tranquilizer, was on an antidepressant. Sometimes medication is suggested for PTSD depending upon the nature of the symptoms. For example, some people experience intense anxiety, so one form of medication might be prescribed. Some others might be experiencing depression, and a different type of medication would be prescribed. But I was not involved with her treatment, and that was left to the jail psychiatrist and therapist to provide her with that medication. The reason I know that she was on this medication is that she told me she was involved, and medical records reflected that.
Regarding the Time article referenced in your presentation, the second bullet point highlights an officer's decision-making process shutting down as an example. If the decision-making process shuts down, how did Jodi get so much done the day Travis was killed?
During the intense, usually relatively short period of time of the acute stress, the higher cognitive levels are no longer processing correctly. The cerebral cortex tends to shut down and gives itself over to the basic survival instincts that are mediated by the old brain, those central parts of the brain that was in the center of the diagram that I showed. So a person can still be making judgments and decisions, but they are not higher level decisions. In other words, one does not sit down and think, well, if I do this, then this will happen, and maybe I should do this instead, or let me start planning something. That doesn't happen during acute stress. It's just survival. If there's a weapon at hand, people can still see. They can grab that weapon. If they're aware that there's a weapon near them, they might be able to grab that weapon. But extravagant planning does not occur during acute stress because of the way that the physiology has changed within the brain.
Did you diagnose any conditions that were not covered in your testimony? If so, what are they?
I diagnosed her as well with an anxiety disorder on the Axis 1 clinical disorder. There was evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety. They're typically seen together. And on an Axis 2 personality diagnosis, I diagnosed her with a personality disorder not otherwise specified. It's definitely a personality disorder, but it had various components in it, and there was not enough information for me to feel definitively comfortable diagnosing her with one personality disorder or another.
When you use the word appears in your explanations about patient condition, does that mean you are not 100% sure?
As I indicated earlier, psychology is the science of behavior. And we're seldom 100% sure of anything in psychology. So when we say appears, what we're really saying is that the preponderance of evidence suggests this presence, but not with 100% certainty. Because as I said, there are a few things in psychology that can reach that level of confidence. But nonetheless, the science functions because we talk in probabilistic terms. There are other sciences that work in the same way, but psychology is particularly prone due to the lack of our precision, our ability to precisely measure what's going on in the brain. Now, we are getting better at that, Neuroscience has advanced tremendously in the last year, 10 and 15 years. And people are now looking with various kinds of imaging techniques to see what areas of the brain actually function under certain conditions. We are beginning to narrow down. There have been studies where electrodes are implanted in certain parts of the brain to see what areas of the brain are functioning during certain types of stimuli. But we can't use that on a routine basis. It's still at the point of research. Perhaps someday we'll be able to be more precise and be able to say things with even greater certainty than we can now.
Are your opinions based on what a patient tells you about what happened to them?
Not solely. You must look, doing an evaluation, it's imperative that you review all available information, collateral interviews, review if it's a crime-related situation, crime scene reports, victim reports, in order to form a complete picture.
In an extreme shock event where the hippocampus blocks the forming of memories, can the brain still function to make a rational decision during that time?
Well, it makes decisions. They're not always rational. For example, in this particular case, a camera was found in the washing machine.
I'm going to object. Previous order of the court.
Approach, please. Sustaining the objection. When discussing intrusive thoughts, did you use the term actors? If so, what did you mean by actors?
Well, what I was referring to was, and I think this relates to the fact that the story changed. A stressful incident occurred. Initially, it was explained that the stressful incident involved two people coming into the house and threatening her life. That's one set of actors. In the second story, it was Mr. Alexander who was going after her and threatening her life. That was the second set of actors, so to speak. He was the second actor. That's what I was referring to, only the change in particular specifics about the situation. Nonetheless, both would have been traumatic experiences.
Regarding the tremors or shakes you witnessed with Jodi, how can you tell it is caused by PTSD or memories rather than fear for herself and her future, fear of being found guilty?
Well, Ms. Arias told me not only did she occasionally shake and indicated to me that time connected it to an incident with Mr. Alexander, but she had other physiological changes as well, including, as we began our discussions and she began telling the second story, she would report to me that her hands became sweaty while she was discussing certain elements. So this is actually a second physiological reaction to thoughts and memories of what had gone on during the attack, at least at the beginning of the attack and the end of the attack, or the end of the incident when she was leaving. And those are the intrusive thoughts that she had. Those tend to produce sweaty palms as well. Shaking was reported in response to thoughts about Mr. Alexander yelling at her, chasing her, so forth.
Did you see Jodi shaking before she ever mentioned it to you?
I did not notice it initially, and the reason for that is because when I interviewed Ms. Arias, I was behind a partition that was about this high, and her hands were down on the table or in her lap. I couldn't see her hands. And there is a screen, a wire mesh screen, a very thick, very strong screen, that truly obliterates your ability to see. So it was very hard for me to observe that. She did point it out at one point. When I inquired about any physiological reactions, she told me that she shakes. Now I asked her, can you show me where it is that you shake? And she demonstrated it, but I don't think that she was shaking at that moment because of something we were talking about. But it would be very difficult for me to see under those conditions of interview.
Are the actions a person performs while the hippocampus is overwhelmed by a severe trauma be autopilot, non-reasoned reactions or choices?
Yes, that's precisely what I'm indicating here. They're not rational, tends to be disorganized, tend to be frenzied, tend to be poorly planned.
Are actions while in this state generally reflective or consistent with one's core personality?
They might be modified to some degree, but again, you're on autopilot here in a case of acute stress. And like in the case of the police officer who had a great deal of control, he knew what he could do, he was still overtaken by the acute stress. Now, he was able to pull out of it. He was able to react in less random, less frenzied ways than someone who had never been in a similar experience. So to the degree that maybe individual differences make a difference how we react, that's probably true. But when the core of the brain takes over and you're in that fight and flight reaction, you're really almost functioning on the instinctual level. And there's not much control over that.
Can these actions be extreme opposites to that? For example, a mild pacifist person becomes a violent, brutal person. Can the mind choose when the hippocampus is overwhelmed?
The brain doesn't choose when the hippocampus is overwhelmed. That's a physiological reaction to signals from the amygdala, which reacts to situations that are creating a danger for that individual. It's completely it's what they call, it's the autonomic nervous system. It's automatic. It's like an emergency system in an elevator, the emergency brake system in an elevator. If the cable snaps, the elevator may start plummeting down, but automatically, disconnected from anything else and using centrifugal force and gravity, the brakes automatically engaged. There's no thought involved with that. The reason that happens that way is that it has to happen quickly. And in order for a fight or flight reaction to occur, it has to happen very, very quickly. And there's little control that we have over that type of reaction.
In the process of killing someone, isn't it possible, even probable, that adrenaline output would increase whether someone was in fight or flight mode or in the act of a premeditated killing?
There's a difference usually between the crime scene of a premeditated killing.
Judge, may we approach?
You may. All right, Dr. Samuels, I'm going to repeat the question. The question is a yes or no question. In the process of killing someone, isn't it possible, even probable, that adrenaline output would increase whether someone was in fight or flight mode or in the act of a premeditated killing?
There are two questions in there, and they have different answers, Your Honor.
All right.
Okay? Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? No.
If not, why? Without referring to this case.
Okay. People are different. People's level of experience are different. If someone is more prepared for a situation, it's less likely that they would go into an acute stress condition. And there are individual differences that it's very difficult to apply to this particular question. But the key is, sometimes it's not impossible, but the likelihood is not very great.
You have compared Jodi's PTSD multiple times to that of police officers and soldiers. Do you think that is a fair comparison, since police officers and soldiers kill as part of their job and duty?
Again, PTSD is a label that is used to identify a list of symptoms. The list of symptoms can be varied from person to person, and the presence of a PTSD disorder in no way suggests that someone didn't do whatever it is that they were involved with. It's simply a way of diagnosing them with a psychiatric diagnosis. So the symptoms are similar. The conditions that cause those symptoms may be different, but both can be said to be suffering from PTSD. But I certainly am not characterizing what happened on that fateful day as being equivalent to a soldier or a police officer doing their work. They're very, very different, even though the diagnosis is the same. If a person is involved in a knife fight and they get a slash in their arm, they have a slash in their arm. If they're in an automobile accident and they have a slash in their arm, they may both be diagnosed in medical terms with a slash in the arm, using the medical terms. But the circumstances that led to those two injuries are very different, even though the injuries are similar.
Is there a diagnosis for selective amnesia?
No, there is not. It is not a DSM diagnosis.
Would you continue to evaluate a person who was not being honest with you?
That happens sometimes, but rarely. But at some point, you have to give up. At some point, it may be appropriate to say to that person, look, I don't feel that you're cooperating with me. Let me find you another evaluator with whom you may feel more comfortable, more open, and more honest. So there are times when you just have to give up. It's foolish to just continue. It's not productive.
Why didn't you re-administer the test once Jodi admitted to killing Travis?
I reviewed the test, and the reality is that her numerical score, which is what is used to determine whether or not a person meets that diagnosis, would not have changed, because the only change in the test is a description of what the most intense stressor was. And the descriptions are used for the purpose of psychotherapy, not for diagnosis. So the presence of the disorder is determined numerically. The particular type of trauma is used for purposes of therapy. So it really didn't need to be re-administered.
It seems 25 to 30 hours is very inadequate to evaluate someone who has killed another person, especially in such a traumatic way that Ms. Arias did, and to diagnose her with PTSD. Wouldn't you agree that this amount of time was inadequate to accurately evaluate and diagnose Ms. Arias?
No, not at all. Typical evaluation may run 6 or 7 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours if you do a lot of testing. If it goes beyond 20 or 30 hours, the nature of the relationship begins to change. You become a constant visitor. There may be a sense that you're a visiting friend. There may be a tendency to want to offer advice to the individual. So unless they were extremely extenuating circumstances, what I gave her in terms of this evaluation by reviewing the material over and over again, then going back when some new material came in, is what I consider to be quite appropriate for this case.
Is the MMPI test utilized for any other uses other than therapy? For example, is it validated for specific job requirements?
Well, that's very controversial. Some companies do give personality tests when they hire people. That's a very controversial area because that's probing into the privacy of an individual. It provides medical and psychological information in an employment file. So the answer is that it's a very controversial area. It is being done. Sometimes it can actually be helpful and beneficial, but I believe it's a violation of the individual's rights to privacy.
Referring to Jodi's diagnosis for PTSD, when did you catch the errors on your report?
When I started to prepare for trial back somewhere in November or December, because this trial has been moving forward. And when I started to review in fine detail, I noticed that I had omitted a couple of letters and numbers. And so I created a separate page with the correct numbers and the various criteria, which I brought to court with me and used as part of my testimony.
Do you feel those were big errors?
Well, they weren't great errors, but it didn't change the outcome of the report. It would have been a little confusing for someone who was reading, and they would probably have pointed it out to me. But they were a couple of typos, and I admit I made them.
You said on redirect that Ms. Arias remembers the beginning of the attack and then the end of the attack. Therefore, she would have a memory of events after the attack ended, such as cleaning up the scene, deleting photos from the camera, putting the gun in the car, and so forth. Correct?
No. She would remember details of the beginning of the trauma, but, and I don't know how much details you've heard in terms of her recollection in other testimony because of the rule of exclusion. I'm not aware of what others have testified to. But what she told me was that she snapped back into reality when she was near the Hoover Dam and discovered herself covered with blood. That's the end of the incident that I'm referring to, when the chemicals in the brain dropped down to a level where her hippocampus and her conscious awareness were able to kick back into normal. That's the end of the event, not the fact that the stabbings may have been over. She was still in an acute stress reaction at that time.
Can the acute stress occur if someone plans to kill versus defending themselves when in danger?
Can you repeat that, Your Honor?
Can the acute stress occur if someone plans to kill versus defending themselves when in danger?
Planned homicide is of a different nature.
Sustained. Can you answer yes or no?
I'm sorry?
Can you answer yes or no?
Could you repeat it one more time? Let me see if I
Yes.
can do it.
Can the acute stress occur if someone plans to kill versus defending themselves when in danger?
Possible, but not probable.
Do you often make mistakes in your reports when you do evaluations?
No.
Can you tell us where Jodi said she was when she was coming out of her fog after the killing?
She recalled going through a police or a border patrol checkpoint near the Hoover Dam. That's when she came to, so to speak, found she was covered with blood, and then she said that she suddenly realized something terrible had happened.
You seem to have several issues with omitting or forgetting to include information. Do you think that it is important to have an accurate and complete report for a trial like this?
Yes.
Why didn't you complete a new PDS after Jodi changed her killing story? If her answers were based on an intruder story, how can you say with certainty that she has PTSD if her answers are fictitious?
The items on the test that a person endorses are basically a list of traumatic experiences. They include things that happened in childhood, They include things that happened around the time of the actual major event, the most recent one. And in looking at her test results, it appears to me that there would be no change in the numerical scoring. The difference would be in the identification of the stressor. Now, it was obvious that a terrible event occurred at the Alexander home. And whether or not it was perpetrated by an outside person or self-perpetrated by her would not change the numerical scoring, but it certainly changes the focus of our attention. If anything, it would make her trauma worse if she was the one who was involved in the killing.
Do you consider yourself an impartial third party in this case?
I try to be at all times.
Do you always develop such a fond relationship with the individuals you evaluate?
I wouldn't characterize our relationship as being fond. I'm an impartial evaluator.
Do you still think that it was appropriate to purchase a gift for Jodi while evaluating her, or do you feel you stepped over an ethical boundary?
There is no ethical guideline regarding purchasing a self-help book for a client that you've just met for the first time. No further discussion of the book occurred. I just happen to be a compassionate person. I've done this with other clients that I've evaluated if I feel it would help them. But since I can't do therapy and I am a compassionate person and I have been doing therapy and evaluations for 35 years, I feel that that is not at all stepping over the boundary.
For the D2 criteria example, you mentioned a phone call between Jodi and her mom. Can you explain what happened on that call and how it fit into that criteria?
Yes. We're not talking about one call. Ms. Arias indicated to me that she frequently gets angry at her mother when she speaks to her. And of course I asked, did this happen once? Did it happen twice? She says, no, it happens with some regularity. So I took that as an indication of irritability.
Would anyone having an argument over the phone with a parent fit that criteria?
She described it as a venting of her anger towards her mother. And in fact, she indicated that that type of venting towards her mother was usually the most intense of any time that she would vent. Her mother became her target for her frustrations.
In your professional opinion, do you think that someone who is able to confront their boyfriends and the women that they are cheating with display assertive behavior?
She may have been somewhat assertive at that particular moment, but in general, she has been a very unassertive person. And that example of that is going along with things that she felt were not right for her, but she went along with it because she felt it would make Mr. Alexander happy. A truly assertive person will stand up for their rights, mark their boundaries, and in a rational manner get the point across that this is not right for them, and if you respect me, you won't do that anymore. She was completely unable to do that. That's a very strong indication of someone who is not assertive.
Do medications cause any of the various amnesias you described?
Well, yes, in fact, there's a category for medically induced amnesia in the DSM. The kind of diagnosis for Jodi, that of dissociative amnesia, which is frequently occurring in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder, is not the same thing. But in hospital settings, with geriatric patients frequently, amnesias can occur as a result of medication. But what's interesting is that once the medication is changed, or they come out of the effects of anesthesia, for example, memory is usually restored.
Since you did not meet with Jodi until December 2009, isn't it fair to say you are not 100% sure that Jodi suffered from acute stress?
That's correct. We'll have to look at her report. We have to look at the crime scene to infer that that actually occurred.
Under cross-examination, you admitted that Jodi having anal sex was relevant to your diagnosis, and then under redirect, you stated it was not relevant. How do you account for this inconsistency in your testimony?
The things we were talking about that are irrelevant was the fact that she had tried anal intercourse with 2 prior boyfriends on a couple of occasions. The part of this anal intercourse that was critical in this case was the frequency with which it occurred in her relationship, and the connection of that to other concerns that were expressed to me about Mr. Alexander's sexual proclivities.
When a patient or client changes the story, misrepresents, or does not necessarily tell the truth to you, does it raise a red flag?
Well, it always raises a red flag, but in my opinion, and consistent with the diagnosis, it is possible that the first story was a form of depersonalization. In other words, a psychological reaction in an attempt not to have to deal with the horrors of what actually transpired on that day. In a sense, she created an alternative reality. Now, you could look at that as a lie, or you could look at that as a psychological defense mechanism and an ultimate example of denial, the creation of an artificial reality. At some point, I actually was considering the diagnosis of a dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality, where a person had multiple personalities at different times, personalities that existed separately but not at the same time. I disregarded that initial hypothesis when I learned more about the case, but certainly that was one of my considerations. Her creation of the story, in my opinion, fits the psychological condition known as denial and known as depersonalization, and it satisfied the need to put an emotional distance between the horrors of that day and her previous belief system of being a peace-loving individual.
Sending a self-help book does not seem that it would ensure the success of an evaluation, but would help to ensure the success of therapy. Would you concur?
I recommend that book, by the way, it is an extremely well-known book. It can help people who are in therapy, and it can help people who have very low self-esteem and make them more comfortable dealing with the realities of their life. That was my main purpose, was to see if I could get her to read that book, perhaps, now I don't know, because I think she told me she read it or was reading it at one time, but I never inquired about it. The idea would be, if she could feel more confident about herself, maybe she could let go of this rationalization, of this denial, of this defense mechanism. Whether that was influential at all, I don't know. But ultimately what happened was that she finally admitted to the second story.
You said on Redirect that if someone is making up a story, their story tends to be consistent. Is that correct?
Frequently, a made-up story will be consistent from recitation to recitation, and presented with pretty much flat affect, because it is rehearsed, and basically they're pulling out that information not from their experience, but from the memorization of this idea, this script that they've developed in their mind. It's hard to deviate from a script if you're memorizing a script. So my feeling was that in the presentation, the television interview, and the early interviews I had, there was a certain degree of consistency, but yet almost a mechanical consistency, and presented with flat affect, which made me suspicious that the story wasn't actually true. Now, of course, I also was aware of the forensic evidence, which would have made this story impossible.
If so, then if Ms. Arias is making up a story currently, wouldn't it make sense that her story is consistent?
Could you repeat that? I'm not sure that the question is clear.
It's a follow-up to the question you just
okay.
answered. You said on Redirect that if someone is making up a story, their story tends to be consistent. Is that correct? The second part is, if so, then if Ms. Arias is making up a story currently, wouldn't it make sense that her story is consistent?
Yes, if the second story is made up, there would be various consistencies within that story. When it was repeated to me a number of times, more details began to be added to the story. I developed a fuller picture of what actually had transpired. So that to me seemed like a more genuine recitation of what actually had transpired.
You stated that you reviewed interviews with Jodi's family and friends as part of her evaluation. Who conducted those interviews?
Those interviews were given to me in summary form by the defense team, and I don't recall who did it. In fact, I think it was an earlier defense team that had accumulated those interviews.
Are there validity scales on the PDS test? If so, were Jodi's validity scores out of the normal range?
There are no validity scales on the PDS.
Does your code of ethics or any other guideline explain what you are to do if you believe someone to be suicidal or a potential harm to themselves? If so, what are those guidelines?
Well, the guidelines are to inform the closest people to that individual. Obviously, Jodi was in jail at the time, jail authorities, and so on. But her discussion of suicide did not have any plan associated with it. And she said that she had been assuming that she would have committed suicide at some point along the way. It's one of the things that she said. I did not see any plan. By the time that I got to her, she was not suicidal. She claimed to have been feeling that way early on in the experience that she had, and I didn't get to see her until many months after she was incarcerated.
Can you review your notes regarding Jodi being tied up by her hands and feet and Travis climaxing as he cut the rope? Was this the day of the killing?
There was one incident on the day of the killing, yes.
Why do you believe Ms. Arias' self-esteem was very low early on in her relationship with Travis, since this is well before the time period that you evaluated her?
Well, from things that she told me and from her writings, but primarily from things that she told me. Her description of the nature of the relationships that she had with men, her description of herself, the fact that she viewed Mr. Alexander as, and these were her words, a better class of guy. She believed, almost considering him to be like a guru, someone who was going to help her rise above the level that she was currently living. And these are things and statements that someone who is looking for an answer, someone who feels they need a hand, will frequently say. She also tolerated abusive behavior, in my opinion, that many assertive women would not put up with, including sexual encounters that were uncomfortable, being disregarded in mixed social situations, being asked to leave the grandmother's house through a window so not to be caught, feeling publicly humiliated, and then going back to the situation with Mr. Alexander. It was a litany of these kinds of stories told to me that made it very easy for me to consider her as a person with low self-esteem.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the noon recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice lunch. You are excused. Please be seated. There's some additional questions. We are at recess. Council, can I see you before you leave for the noon recess?